The story begins in a time before stories, before memory, before time itself had meaning. 7 million years ago, deep in what is now the heart of Chad, the earth was not as we know it. The skies burned red at dusk, the ground was black with ash and ancient roots, and the forests whispered with the breath of forgotten predators. From that heat and dust, a shadow stirred. It was not a man, but it was not a beast either. It was Sahelanthropus cadensis, the first known flicker in the long chain of humanity. No taller than a child, with a face caught between ape and man, it walked under the blazing sun and the heavy canopies of a prehistoric world. Its arms were still made for climbing, but its legs, fragile, awkward, had begun to carry it upright. It was here, perhaps for the first time, that something born of the jungle dared to rise on 2 feet and meet the horizon eye to eye. Its skull was small, its brain the size of an orange, but its eyes faced forward, as if curiosity had already taken root. It had no language, no tools, no fire, yet it felt the world with a strange awareness. It was scary, but it also paused to observe. It did not speak, but it listened to the rustling leaves, the growl of distant predators, the crackle of dry twigs under its own cautious steps. The world around it was brutal. Crocodile beasts lay in the marshes. Saber-fanged creatures roamed the grass. Death came from every shadow, and yet this small, ancient being continued to move forward, not fast, not fierce, but with a kind of defiance that had no name yet. It grasped branches with ancient fingers. It squatted near riverbeds and sniffed the air for danger. It learned, day by day, where the snakes nested and where the fruits ripened. One night, under a sky littered with stars untouched by pollution or memory, it looked up, and in that gaze was something new. It was not thought of, not yet, but it was something, a flicker, a spark, perhaps a question. And so it walked, leaving the first footprints of a journey that would span millions of years. A silent promise, pressed into the ancient mud, that life would rise. That one day, the earth would remember this shape and call it human. The forest was not silent. It inhaled and exhaled like a living thing, a vast, tangled creature of roots and shadow. For the Sahelanthropus, this was both cradle and crucible. Every tree held secrets older than bones. Every path was a question that could not be asked in words. It moved through this world not as a ruler, but as a ghost. Its feet left faint prints in the wet loam. Its fingers brushed against the rough bark of trees that had never known fire. It knew the world not by thought, but by instinct, by the twitch of the leaves, the scent of nearby rot, the shift of silence when something deadly was close. At times it climbed, awkwardly, clinging to ancient branches, just as its ancestors had done for millions of years. But more and more, it stayed on the ground. Its spine had begun to tilt. Its skull balanced differently, subtly, but irrevocably. A simple shift, unnoticed by the beasts around it. But history itself would later tremble from that one anatomical whisper. It was here, in the belly of the forest, that danger hunted in silence. Leopards the size of lions moved through the canopy. Birds with eyes like amber jewels screamed above the treetops. Snakes that glided like water waited at every turn. And yet, the Sahelanthropus moved on. It did not challenge the jungle, it endured it. It bent without breaking. It learned the patterns of the dying sun. It followed insect trails to fallen fruit. It drank from shallow pools where crocodiles lurked just beneath the surface. It watched other creatures, not just for survival, but for understanding. That was new. One day, a flash of lightning struck a dry tree nearby. For the first time, the forest screamed in fire. The Sahelanthropus flinched and fled, but it turned to look back. And in that gaze was not just fear. There was wonder, not understanding, but something close. That night, huddled beneath a rocky overhang, it touched a burned twig. It sniffed it, rubbed it between its fingers. The scent of ash was written into its memory, an omen of something that would one day become a tool, a weapon, a hearth. It did not know fire, but it remembered it. And so the forest watched as the first hominin walked onward, not with purpose, but with potential. No one named it. No one marked its passing. But the soil remembered. The trees remembered. And deep within the bones of the earth, a story had begun that would never be unwritten. Long before language, before even the idea of names, the world was a scripture written in scent, movement, and blood. The Sahelanthropus was not alone in this world, but it was different. Around it, the beasts of the Miocene moved with ancient confidence. They were complete, whole. But this creature, it was unfinished, incomplete, becoming. Its senses were sharp, honed by danger, but something deeper stirred behind those forward-facing eyes. It began to linger when it could have fled, to pause, to observe. It noticed things, the way the wind bent grass before a storm, the way ants marched with direction, the way death approached, not as chaos, but with rhythm. And in that noticing, something awoke. It began to follow the movements of other animals, not to hunt, but to understand. It tracked them silently, copying their habits, their paths, their rituals. A herd of small primates bathed in morning sun. The Sahelanthropus watched, then one day mimicked their grooming. A group of wild pigs unearthed bulbs with their snouts, and later, it returned to dig with fingers, learning from what was not its own. It had no tribe, no mate. It may have been the last of its kind, or the first. A flicker in the middle of extinction and genesis. When it was wounded, it found certain leaves that soothed, not by reason, by memory. When it was hungry, it remembered which trees bled sweet sap. It had no words for these discoveries, no stories, but it carried them, in its bones, in its behavior, in the flickers of its nervous system, as if evolution itself was whispering slowly, carefully, in its blood. One night, after a hard rain, it found the body of another creature, broken, still, silent. It did not feed. It did not flee. It stayed. It touched the body, sniffed it, sat beside it. No predator would do this. No instinct could explain it. Was it grief? Was it confusion? No one can say. But it marked something new. A pause. A recognition of absence. The jungle went on, uncaring. But this tiny life, this half-formed shadow of man, was becoming something the world had never seen, a witness. Not to conquer, not yet, but to begin. It still could not speak, but already it had begun to listen to the world in ways no creature had before. It began to remember, not as we remember, not with language or linear time, but with the body, with sensation, with the pull of instinct sharpened by experience. The Sahelanthropus, ancient and fragile, began to carve a kind of internal map of where danger lived, where fruit bloomed late, where water pooled, dark and still after rains. It began to avoid the red ferns that left rashes. It returned to trees whose bark soothed the stomach. It recognized the smell of predators not only by fear, but by pattern. This was not just instinct. This was a memory, raw, silent, unspoken, written in the bones. There was no fire yet, no burial, no art. But in a world where everything killed or died, this memory was sacred, and it was changing the one who held it. Each day was a trial by nature. The ground cracked beneath its feet. Heat rose in shimmering waves. Food was scarce, competition endless. Larger primates roared from the treetops. Hyenas with saber-like teeth patrolled the dry open spaces. But it adapted. I became more careful, more precise. It moved through the undergrowth with purpose, not panic. Its fingers began to test stones, not to shape them, not yet, but to select the right one for digging, for cracking seeds. A beginning, a hint. It chose places to sleep where the wind masked its scent. It climbed higher when the air grew heavy with moisture, sensing storm and flood. It was vulnerable, yes, but in that vulnerability, something extraordinary was emerging. The beginnings of choice. 1,000 other creatures moved purely on reflex. But this being, somewhere between ape and man, had begun to decide when to flee, when to rest, when to explore. It was not thought as we know it, but it was a fracture in the wall of instinct, a breach, and in that breach, evolution poured possibility. Sometimes, when it sat alone beneath the canopy, listening to the groan of old trees and the howls of distant beasts, it would look up, not in fear, but in silence. Its eyes would follow the flight of birds. Its fingers would press into the dirt as if seeking something below. It did not know what it longed for, but it longed. That longing, for safety, for warmth, for meaning, was the ghost of what would one day become art, and music, and fire. But for now, it remained alone, a flickering thought in a world that could not yet think. There is a silence deeper than the absence of sound, the silence of being alone in a world not yet made for you. The Sahelanthropus did not know it was alone. It did not know that it walked a path no one had walked before. But its body felt it, the emptiness between encounters, the echo of steps never followed by others. It moved through the forest not as part of a group, but as a single question in a language the earth hadn't yet invented. Other animals passed in herds, packs, flocks. They groomed each other, cried warnings, shared warmth. But the Sahelanthropus watched from the undergrowth, unseen, uninvited. It had no voice to call, no bond to form, no name to answer. And so, in the crushing vastness of that primeval world, it wandered. But loneliness has weight, and from that weight, something began to form, a yearning, a pull toward others, toward something. It was not yet love, not yet tribe, but it was the blueprint of both. One day, it heard a sound, not the roar of a predator or the shriek of birds, but something close, something like its own voice. It froze, heart pounding. The sound came again, low, uncertain, a murmur, a whisper, another like itself. It crept forward, slowly, breath held. There, in the dappled light of morning, another figure, slightly hunched, small, covered in the dust of the forest. Their eyes met. They did not speak. They did not touch. But they did not flee. For the first time, perhaps in generations, two echoes of future humanity stood together, not in conflict, but in recognition. They watched each other, mirrored each other, and then, as silently as they had come, they parted, but the memory remained. From that point forward, the Sahelanthropus began to look for others, on tracks, in broken branches, in the sudden hush of birds. It began to listen for voices, not just danger. It began to wait longer at watering holes, to sit beneath fruit trees not just to feed, but in hope. Hope, the wildest invention of all. And though it remained alone more often than not, something had changed. It now carried an image in its mind, of another, of presence, of possibility. That image would become legend, would become family, would become a tribe. But here, in the shadow of extinction, it was just a memory of shared breath, enough to carry the first human through another night. In the kingdom of the Miocene, survival belonged to the giants. Saber-fanged predators ruled the shadows. Massive apes swung through the canopy with ease. Even the reptiles were relics of ancient power, armored, fanged, unforgiving. But the Sahelanthropus was none of these. It had no claws, no thunderous roar, no thick hide to deflect teeth. It could not outrun its hunters, nor outfight its rivals. Its power was different, softer, but older. It was the power of staying alive, of reading the world when the world offered no mercy. It walked low and careful, always listening. Its ears became attuned to the warning silence that fell before an ambush. Its eyes learned to trace the shifting patterns of grass pressed by passing feet. It read the forest like an ancient scroll, one danger at a time. Its footsteps grew wiser with each season. Where others died in storms, it sought the high roots of fig trees that rose like cathedrals above the floodplain. Where others starved, it cracked open termite mounds and dug for hidden roots. Where the air grew thick with rot and disease, it moved higher, into cooler places, toward cleaner streams. It had no spear, no flame, and yet it endured. Endurance became its weapon, and slowly, silently, this endurance carved changes into its body. Its hips shifted, its legs steadied. It walked more upright, though still clumsy. But each movement forward was a quiet rebellion against what came before, a declaration that something new was possible. Its hands, still curved from millions of years in the trees, began to linger longer on certain stones. It did not yet make tools, but it began to select them. The right size, the right edge. It smashed a fruit here, dug a grub there, a gesture that would echo through millennia. And with every challenge, every predator narrowly avoided, it added to the invisible inheritance of its kind. That inheritance was not passed in words or stories. It was passed in the shape of joints, in the path of nerves, in the sharpening instinct that whispered, "Move here, not there. Wait, watch, live." It was not strong like the leopard, not fast like the gazelle, but it was watching. And through that watching, it was learning a kind of mastery, not of the forest, but of itself. It was the first creature to bend rather than break. And in that bending, it would lay the foundation for every future footstep across savannas, deserts, and eventually, stars. Change does not shout. It whispers. And in the soft, unnoticed days of Sahelanthropus, change had begun to take root, slow as moss, subtle as breath. The world did not yet know it was watching the beginning of something new. But deep in the forests and floodplains, evolution had shifted direction. The Sahelanthropus no longer lived within the world like its ancestors. It had begun to live with it. It moved differently now, less from fear, more from choice. It still climbed, still fled, still fed like all others, but there was something new in its gait. It returned to places. It retraced steps. It was tested, compared, and decided. This was not survival alone. It was a strategy. It began favoring one type of stone over another. Not always for use. Sometimes just to carry, to hold. Perhaps it liked the feel, the balance, the sound it made when dropped. In those simple acts lay the root of what would one day be called preference, then taste, and eventually, culture. On cool mornings, it waited longer before moving. When injured, it lingered in places with soft mud and clean water. These decisions were not random. They were measured, felt. That was the fracture point, the moment when the creature ceased being just a reaction to nature and began to act within it, to shape its own behavior against the indifference of the wild. It still had no words, but it had begun to make decisions based not only on the moment, but on memory, perhaps even in imagination, a shadow of what might happen. In one moment, it pressed a stick into a hole and withdrew it covered in ants. It licked them, then repeated the gesture. Again and again, not instinct, learning. And with learning came repetition. And with repetition, intention. That intention was the dawn of creation. It was not making fire. Not yet. But it had begun to arrange its world, to engage it. It was the first creature to turn nature into an idea, something that could be tested, not just survived. And when it rested beneath trees, or stared at the sky heavy with stars, something stirred. Not thought as we know it, but an echo, a flicker, the first outline of a mind looking beyond the moment. It still looked like a beast, but its path no longer belonged to beasts. It had crossed the edge of becoming, and history, silent and vast, had begun to follow. Time did not yet have names. No seasons, no calendars, no hours carved in stone. But even so, it moved, and the Sahelanthropus began to feel it, not in years, but in rhythms. The dry months came. The rivers shrank into silence. Fruit vanished. Insects burrowed deep or died. And then, the rain returned, loud, sudden, and wild. The forest breathed again. This was not knowledge, but memory felt in the blood. The creature had lived through cycles now. It remembered the burnt leaves, the dry wind, and hunger. It learned to wait beneath certain trees for fruit, to follow the migrations of other animals without understanding why. This was the first form of history, not told in words, but walked again and again. But time does more than pass. It takes. One morning, the Sahelanthropus came upon a still body, another of its kind. Cold, hollow, eyes no longer seeking. The smell of death was familiar. The world was full of it. But this was different. It did not flee. It stayed. It sat beside the body, watched the flies gather, and touched the hand. It did not feed. I did not forget. Something inside paused, not for safety, but for grief. It did not know the word, but it felt the space the other had once filled, a space that now echoed. And it was remembered. That memory, silent, without shape, was more than survival. It was the first form of mourning, the first shadow of the story. Later, when it wandered alone, it returned to that place. Sat there again, not for food, not for water, for something else, as if the earth there carried a different meaning, a memory that clung to roots and air. And so the Sahelanthropus became not just a traveler, but a rememberer. Its path through the forest was no longer random. It had places it returned to, sites that held weight, places where something had happened. It began to navigate not just by the body, but by a rising sense of place, of meaning tied to land. That was the seed of sacredness. It still did not bury, but it stopped. It was memorable. It hesitated in places where others were lost. This hesitation was not weakness. It was evolution rippling forward through emotion. The world around it, red earth, towering trees, screeching skies, still roared with indifference. But this small, upright creature had begun to carry something no other life form yet possessed, the ghost of time. Before words, there was breath. Before the speech, there was sound, not shaped, not summoned, but released. And the forest heard it. The Sahelanthropus did not speak. It could not name the things it saw, nor ask the sky for rain, nor call another from across the trees. But something had begun, subtle as a hum, short as a chirp, the beginning of sound with meaning. At first, it was nothing, a grunt when startled, a hiss when threatened, a whimper in pain. But slowly, these noises were not just reactions. They became signals. A low moan when danger lurked nearby, a sharp exhale before flight, a soft click while foraging, perhaps to keep another like itself aware or near. These weren't sentences, but they weren't silent either. This was proto-communication, the first flickers of shared experience through rhythm and tone. When the wind howled at night, the Sahelanthropus sometimes mimicked it, not for purpose, but from something deeper. Mimicry, echo, the same way birds would later learn to sing. This creature began to repeat the world around it, to rehearse it in sound. One day, it tapped a stone against a tree trunk, not once, but twice. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow. It did it again, then again. It wasn't trying to build or break. It was listening, playing, reacting to the sound itself. This was the birth of rhythm, not music yet, but the pleasure of pattern. Another day, it heard rain falling through leaves and slapped its thigh in pace with the drops. Not consciously, not for art, but something about the beat soothed the ancient nerves inside, something older than understanding. And slowly, its own vocalizations became more refined, softer when curious, harsher when defensive. It began to experiment with pitch, with length, with repetition. These changes didn't just say things, they carried emotion. That was the real leap. It wasn't the sound itself, it was the feeling behind it. When it cried out in pain and another came closer, it remembered. When it growled and the other turned away, it understood. These moments built something sacred, shared meaning. There was still no grammar, no names. But there was now a way for two creatures to shape each other's actions, with sound. And sound, when repeated with meaning, is the first root of language. So in that ancient jungle, beneath rain-soaked leaves and predator-filled nights, a sound escaped a small, upright figure. And for the first time, the universe listened back. Not with words, not yet, but with response. There was no fire yet, No sparks split from stone, no ash carried on the wind, no glowing hearth around which stories would later rise. And yet, something sacred had begun. The Sahelanthropus did not know of the ceremony. But it repeated. It returned to the same trees to eat. It laid its body in the same crook of roots. It washed in the same stream bend, under the same leaning rock. These were not just habits. They were rituals of survival, patterned behaviors, shaped by memory, honed by instinct. And ritual is where culture is born. It began to observe, not just the forest, but others like itself. When one moved, the other watched. When one crouched to drink, another waited. When one paused at a sound, the others froze too. There was no leader. There was no command. But there was rhythm between them. One day, it noticed the fallen body of another. A broken limb, a still chest, a silence that did not uncoil. The Sahelanthropus did not weep. But it did wait. It lingered. It sniffed the air, looked at the unmoving form, and stayed nearby, longer than survival demanded. And then it left, but not without marking the place. A stone moved. A branch dragged. A circle walked. The beginning of mourning. Not with tears, not with prayers, but with presence. Over time, it began to touch the world differently. Not just use it. It smoothed stones with repetition. It stacked seeds and berries. It placed objects near others, not with full purpose, but not without it either. Perhaps it found a stone that felt cold longer than others. Perhaps it liked the way a bone curved in its hand. These preferences, meaningless to others, were the first aesthetic instincts. The root of art is not beauty. It is attention, and attention had awoken. The Sahelanthropus began to teach without trying. A young one followed its elder to the tree where grubs hid beneath bark. Not by word, but by mimicry. Not by reason, but by watching. A behavior passed on, not just done. This is the quiet definition of culture, when memory leaves the body of one and enters another without dying. There was no tribe yet, no tribe name, no shared myths or carved totems. But there were ritual acts, small, nameless patterns that lasted. And in those patterns, in those repeated touches of bark and bone, Sahelanthropus left behind its first true invention, continuity. In the end, Sahelanthropus vanished not with a battle, not with a flood, but with time, the slow disappearance of a shadow when the sun changes angle. No burial ground remains, no carved bone, no lasting flame, but something echoed. For nearly 1,000,000 years, its kind walked through forests and along dried lake beds. And then they were gone. But they did not fail. From them came the ones who bent knuckles into fists. From them came those who stood taller, who cracked stones into blades, who chased antelope across grassland dust. Each descendant carried forward a spark, not of fire, but of memory. We would name it later, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, but names are only a trick of the modern tongue. The truth is simpler, we are still them. Every time a child mimics their mother's gesture, Sahelanthropus returns. Every time a hand reaches out in the dark for comfort, so does it. When someone pauses before speaking, when they shape meaning in breath, it is not just speech. It is a legacy. We did not rise as a new creature. We unfolded from them. The curve of our spine, the doubt in our eyes, the wonder we feel when hearing wind through leaves, none of this is new. It is all echo. They never knew gods, but they looked up. They never knew death, but they lingered. They never knew names, but they felt a connection. Sahelanthropus was not a king, not a prophet, not even fully human, but it was the first to walk alone, upright against the trees, with a mind just beginning to dream of something more. And though it vanished 7,000,000 years ago, its shadow still moves in our gestures, in our caution, in our curiosity. So next time you walk quietly through trees, or feel the hush of an early dawn, remember, once, that was all we were. And once, that was enough to begin everything.